What's up? It's AJ. Gonna do a quick video here on the arm and pendulum exercise. This is basically to kind of give you an idea of not only how to deal in the abstract, maybe with just basic shapes and things, but how they correlate to more complex actions that you'll be getting into later on. So we're going to start out here with a pendulum, and surprise, surprise, we're going to move to an arm swing. These are basically the same kind of thing. The way you'll treat it is fairly similar. So starting out here, I just want to help you with taking some of the things you've been doing up to now with the graph editor and slow ins and slow outs and all that kind of stuff and the spacing of an object, and kind of go into how you can push your stuff in different ways. So we're going to do a little bit of the stealing frames thing. We're going to be doing some overlap here as well, so getting into some new stuff. So hope you enjoy this one. So basically, to start out, right now you've got 3 keys. You're going to see this in your scene at the top control. Fairly straightforward there, but if you're trying to make a pendulum swing and make it look interesting, right off the bat, if you look at this, you're going to see that this is kind of not that interesting. It feels kind of even, right? If you ever remember, Pong or something where, the little ball is like floating around the screen and it kind of moves at a constant rate, kind of boring. When things move at constant rates, they feel kind of boring. And this is not perfectly constant. It does slow in on the extremes, but not enough for my taste. So I'm going to actually keep this play blast, and we'll refer to this in a moment here, because I'm going to show you how to, by stealing frames, you can actually add sort of ease-ins and faster motions in other areas. So I'll show you how to do that right here, right off the bat. And I'm going to use the Go Selected so you can see the spacing of this object as we swoop through the extremes. So as you can see, key 1 is basically at one extreme, the middle key here is at the other, and then it returns right back. So, fairly straightforward on this. Generally, when you're doing a cycle, by the way, you want to kind of pull this in one frame. Why is that? Well, the last frame is actually going to be the same as the first. So just a little heads up there. Not a big deal, but it does visually, when you hit play and you want something to loop smoothly, you really do want that to kind of flow that way. So our last key there at 36 is basically the same as the first. So what do we want to do here? I don't want this to kind of have similar spacing all the way throughout, and it kind of does. As you can see, the distance from here to there to there to there to there, these are all kind of very similar, and that's not good when it comes to animation. So we need to kind of do what we can to have this spend a little bit more time at the extremes and swoop through the middle a little bit faster. So what I'm going to show you how to do here is take, let's say you're like, you know what, I want to ease out over a greater number of frames. How can I do that? Well, what you can do is you can say, I like this position at like 3, let's say, and I'm like, I just wanted to hold that position or take longer to get from 1 to this position on 3. So all you have to do is take 3 and say, well, okay, I want it to hit this point. I just want it to hit a little later. So go ahead and take that one, middle mouse out to like 6, and hit the S key. And you'll notice that things start to shift slightly. Let's go ahead and scrub through and see the difference. So now, look at the spacing differences. We're easing out of this position, and then it really starts to get much further apart as we go. So what about this next extreme? We're slowing into this side, right? Remember, if you're thinking in terms of physics, what is the pendulum doing as it falls? Well, it's falling, okay? So that means it's accelerating. Gravity is a thing, and it's going to cause this object to fall and accelerate on its way down. But here's where things get a little tricky. What happens when it crosses the middle and it now starts to climb? Well, if it's climbing, it's fighting gravity. Right? So if it's accelerating on the way down, because things that fall tend to accelerate down, on its way up, it's going to, yes, you guessed it, decelerate. So if we're going to try to make this ease into this area at the end here, what would you do then? Well, what if I like this position on 17 and I want it to ease in sooner? I could actually take this and middle mouse out a few frames and hit the S key. And now you'll see, oh, wait a minute, that kind of shifted, right? So let's look at what had happened. You see how now the spacing through the middle is much, much greater, and the spacing on the extremes is much, much closer together. We've basically created higher contrast in our spacing. I have not changed our timing at all. It still hits the extremes on 1, on 19, and on 36. So it's the same thing. But now we swoop through this, And let's go ahead and do that on the other side of this as well, because as it eases out, same way we did here, as this eases out, we basically went 2 frames after and then middle moused out about 3 frames. So I'll just do that over here as well. Go about 2 frames, middle mouse out 3, hit the S key, and you'll see that that starts to change the spacing. And you can do that over here as well. Just middle mouse, once you hit what you like, middle mouse out 2 or 3 frames, hit the S key. It will change your spacing quite a bit. And now what I'll do is I'm going to turn off the ghosting, because we can actually compare this to the other one. So now you'll get a much snappier swoop through the middle, which visually is a little bit more entertaining. And once you add overlap here, that's where it really starts to get, fun. So you don't want something as boring as this. This feels kind of constant, right, by comparison? Like if you had a choice between this or this, this is much more entertaining and interesting to watch. Now, if you wanted it more subtle, I can show you how to do that real quick. Like let's say you were looking at this and you're going, yeah, it's a bit strong though. All you have to do is take this and move it in 1, and take this one, move it in 1. So it's less extreme. That's really all you're doing. So you can do that and say, okay, well, I'll play less of that, see how it looks. And find the sweet spot, So it's still, that's pretty snappy still. It's much, much better than what we had before. So let's go with that. Now you're ready to add some overlap, okay? So we have 4 controls down the chain here, which if you add them all together, they are rotation based. So you can just kind of do this sort of curl nice thing right there. Based on your rig that you'll have available, this thing, it is what is known as an FK chain. What does FK stand for? It's forward kinematic. You can sound super cool at parties when you tell people you've been animating forward kinematic rigs. Maybe it's some sort of engineering thing. Who knows? Basically what it means is it figures out the math forward down the chain. So it goes from here out forward, if that makes sense. Now, there are other rigs that you'll be using as you go forward through the program that will be inverse kinematic rigs. What's the difference? Well, if forward kinematics works out the math this way from inside out, well, inverse is backwards. It basically, inverse figures out where do I want, let's say, the hand of a character. You can actually say, I want the hand to be exactly in this location, and then it figures out what to do with the arm backwards. So FK is forward, IK is backwards or inverse. You'll see that in mostly legs and arms, and then FK chains you'll see very often on sometimes arms. The backs, a back rig of a character, fingers on a character are generally FK. So just so you get some of that vernacular down, it's not that important, but you will hear that stuff as you go along. And it's helpful to know what people are talking about. So right off the bat, we have all 4 of our controls selected. Why do I have all 4? Well, if you grab just one and you just start doing this kind of thing, it starts to, as you can see, it gets kind of a break to it. If you want this to feel smooth, grab all of them. It will give it a much more organic feel as you go. Think of it like, going off of what I mentioned with the back, your back has a bunch of vertebrae, right? Vertebrae. All of these things can't just independently say, oh, I'm going to move this way, but the rest of you can just stay where you are. Like, you don't want to grab, like, this control and say, okay, well, I'm going to move this independently. You want it to feel like it's part of the greater whole when you're doing overlap. That doesn't mean that you can't create an S-curve or something like that, but what I want you to concentrate on here is very, very simple overlap, just hitting those extremes and swinging from one extreme to the other. So let me show you what I mean. I'm going to place a key at our extremes. Of course, those were, if we go back to our friend here, we had that extreme at 19 and then at 36. So I'm actually going to bring this over so we can concentrate on that as well. But I'm going to grab all 4 of these. And you might be thinking, do I have to independently grab all of these every time? Actually, no, you don't. You can go up here to Create Sets, Quick Select Set. And if you have those 4 selected, you can just go right here and make a button and call it whatever you want. You can call this, I don't know, pendulum, whatever you want to do. Sometimes I'll if I'm having a bad day, I'll put an expletive and I'll spell out whole sentences with my quick selection sets. You can do that. Basically, just push this button. It selects the whole thing. It's fantastic. Now, every time you want to select that, you don't have to worry about all of it. You can just push this button, hit the pen button, and you're good to go. So I'm just going to hit the S key there, and then, of course, at 36. So these are our extremes. Right now, I just placed placeholder keys there. So what if I want this to overlap? Well, as this leaves this extreme position, do you remember that Newtonian phrase? It's really kind of a law, but that's okay. I'll call it a phrase. An object in motion tends to stay in motion, and more importantly for this case, an object at rest tends to stay at rest. Well, this pendulum is, let's say, once it hits that perfect extreme, let's say for the sake of argument that that is at rest. So let's say you start your scene at this moment and you let go of the pendulum and it begins to fall. The end of this pendulum wants to stay at rest. It doesn't want to go on the ride. This is saying, well, actually, sorry, but we have to go. So it's going to swing this down. So if an object at rest tends to stay at rest, do you think that the end here is going to want to stay where it is right now? So as I go a few frames out, don't you think like this is going to want to kind of drag back that way? It's going to want to stay where it was. So when you're creating overlap, you might want to ease out of that position, but more importantly, you want to drag the object. And, really they're the same principle, but two words that people use when describing overlap is, one is overlap and the other is follow through. One third word that I tend to use when making sense of overlap is I'll use the word drag. And to me, that word denotes that this, whatever it is I'm overlapping, is following some other primary action. So it's not the same as secondary motion. Secondary motion is a whole other principle. We won't get into that right now. But overlap and follow through and drag basically dictates that this is what's leading the action and this is dragging behind. Now, by using that word, I kind of inherently know, okay, this is not going to be ahead of the action. It's not going to be pointing this way. It's going to be pointing back to where it's coming from. If you think of it in those terms, that will probably help you quite a bit. So if need be, you can kind of shift these keys out, as you go. Maybe you want a little bit more drag that way. You can do that. So as it swoops through, once you hit this extreme here, remember when we placed our key right about there, you might want to continue it dragging a little bit behind. So you get this sort of an effect. And then you'll hit this extreme, and then as it swings back the other way, maybe you'll go a few frames out and drag it beyond, because now it has some momentum behind it, right? So you'll go ahead and do that, hit that extreme, key it like so, and then swing it back the other way, and it's going to hit that, and of course overlap back the other way. So you can actually take this and maybe push it further, because remember, as it comes in here, it's going to have some extra momentum to it. So you might even want to go right here and say, I'm really going to push this further. So it really kind of swings, and then I'll go one frame in. Remember, when you're play blasting, you don't want it to include that final frame because that's the same as the first. It'll basically effectively hold that frame for two frames. So now you can kind of see, okay, we've got some basics of overlap going on in here. Is it perfect? No. I would probably go in and maybe tweak a couple things. So like as we hit this extreme here and we come through, notice that it doesn't quite have enough momentum as it goes into that. So I think we could probably do a little bit more there. I think this extreme is a little bit smoother than the other, so we could probably tweak some of that stuff. But what I want you to think about is not only those extremes, but think about where the pendulum is at a given moment. If it's at this extreme right here at 24, and we go here to there, what's to say we can't push this even further? So remember, it wants to be at that extreme. It wants to point there. So you can go in and add a breakdown that might push this even further. And you can do that over on this side as well. As we swing out from that extreme, you might want to go here and say, well, I really want to push this. But just keep your eye where it was at its extreme. See where it is right here? I'm going to leave my cursor right here so you can see. I could take this pose right here on 10 and bring the end of this pendulum right where my cursor was there. So I could take this and pull it even further till it's about there, and you'll get more of a whip. Now that might be a bit too much, because it's kind of curling up, so I'll tone that down a little bit. Something like that. And then actually, maybe I'll push this a little bit more. Like so it's like the other side. And that'll give it a bit more of a snappy overlap. Does that make sense? Think about that. Try it out. And then when you're ready, you'll actually go in and say, okay, cool. Now I want to add the arm.
Gravity is working against me.